A scream gets stuck in the throat as a dull, crushing blow to the head plunges the world into a ringing, velvety darkness. Cold, indifferent steel touches sweat-damp skin, biding its time, and from this promise of pain, an icy, paralyzing terror courses through the body. Then it bites into living flesh with a crunch, and the world explodes into pure, unadulterated agony, tearing apart the remnants of a clouded, slipping consciousness. The bone cracks and shrieks under the pressure of a fine-toothed saw, filling the stale air with a nauseating, vibrating, grating sound that penetrates not through the ears, but directly into the skull, into the very brain. The nauseating smell of burning flesh and the vicious hiss of white-hot iron being pressed with force against the open, bleeding, pulsating wound on your leg. Thick, warm blood streams onto the dirty, splintered wooden floor, greedily soaking into the sawdust and mixing with the pus and remnants of previous, less fortunate victims. Consciousness slowly fades, turning into a viscous fog, but the pain remains, eternal, all-consuming, pulsating in every cell like a second, monstrous heartbeat. This is not healing. It is a ritualistic, hurried dismemberment, and you are but a nameless victim on the cold altar of despair, offered as a sacrifice to the god of speed. The surgeon, clad in an apron stiff and crusty with dried blood and pus, works quickly, his hands a hammer and chisel, not healing palms. He is not a savior, he is a butcher, hacking away the rot to save what can still be saved, but his touch brings not only pain, but also an unseen, delayed death. They survived the knife, the saw, and the hot iron, but then a strange, relentless internal fire consumed them. Fever burned them from within, and the wounds that were supposed to heal turned into festering, foul-smelling ulcers, exuding a sweetish, nauseating, cadaverous stench. Doctors watched in silent horror as their patients, who had survived the hell of surgery, died one by one from an invisible enemy that was relentless and cruel. They defeated the trauma but lost the battle with a spectre that followed every stroke of the scalpel, turning hospital wards into the antechambers of the morgue. The ancients used to say that what medicines do not cure, the knife cures, and what the knife does not cure, fire cures. But they overlooked a new, more terrible truth. What the knife did not cure, the surgeon's very touch killed, and no one on earth understood why. On the bloody battlefields of the 16th century, the air was thick with acrid gunpowder smoke, the metallic smell of fresh blood, and the death cries of the wounded. A young military surgeon, Ambroise Paré, looked upon the endless stream of maimed soldiers, and his heart clenched with helpless horror, for he knew what was about to begin. He saw his colleagues, following a centuries-old dogma, boil elderberry oil in huge copper cauldrons, turning it into a hellish, bubbling concoction for torture. The soldiers howled like beasts as swabs soaked in this boiling liquid were plunged into their open, torn wounds, supposedly to cauterize a non-existent gunpowder poison. The smell of burnt human flesh was considered the smell of healing, but Paré saw in the eyes of these wretches only a primal, animalistic agony, which was too often followed by eternal emptiness. He saw how the treatment prescribed by the great minds of the past became more agonizing and deadly than the very wound it was meant to heal. On one fateful, momentous night, after a particularly bloody assault on Turin, the oil ran out. Dozens of soldiers lay on the cold, damp ground, awaiting an agonizing death from gunpowder poison, which there was now no one to cauterize. Paré felt guilty and helpless, like a traitor who had condemned them to their doom. In desperation, he decided to at least ease their final hours by simply dressing their wounds with a soothing ointment to make their deaths less painful. He mixed what little he had on hand, egg yolk to nourish the tissues, rose oil for fragrance, and turpentine as a mild antiseptic. He carefully applied this simple, almost rustic mixture to the torn, bleeding wounds, expecting nothing but the patient's swift death from infection. He did not sleep all night, tormented by guilt, certain that at dawn he would see rows of dead men before him who had died through his fault due to his unforgivable oversight and lack of oil. But when the first faint rays of sun touched the camp, a revelation awaited him that would forever change medicine and save millions of lives. The soldiers whose wounds he had treated with the simple ointment were sleeping peacefully, their fevers had subsided, and the inflammation around their wounds had noticeably decreased. They were alive and calm. And the few lucky ones for whom there had been enough boiling oil and who were treated according to all the rules of science were either howling and groaning in feverish agony or had fallen silent forever, their bodies already beginning to stiffen. The contrast was so stark, so shocking, that Paré could not believe his eyes, doubting his own sanity. Paré understood the terrible, devastating truth. There had never been any poison in gunpowder. For centuries, surgeons had been torturing their patients, blindly following an ancient, cruel misconception passed down to them through books. They were not burning out poison, they were inflicting a deep burn, unbearable pain, and a certain agonizing death from shock and infection upon fresh wounds. This accidental, forced experiment proved that the most terrible weapon in the world is ignorance in the hands of a savior convinced he is right. Paré vowed that day to never again so cruelly cauterize the unfortunate wounded. He had started a revolution, but victory over pain and filth was still a long way off. Even after this great discovery, operating theatres remained slaughterhouses and surgery a bloody and despised craft. Surgeons, often equated with barbers, bone setters, and executioners, were looked down upon by learned physicians who considered manual labor dirty and undignified. They were craftsmen, not scientists. They wore black or dark brown frock coats not out of modesty or mourning, but to hide the indelible ingrained stains of blood, pus, and other bodily fluids. An old, blood-soaked surgical gown was a point of pride, like a general's uniform, a testament to hundreds of battles won on the operating table. Their instruments, inlaid with ivory and silver, were passed from one unfortunate soul to another, at best rinsed in a bowl of cold, murky water. No one thought about invisible filth, about something that could not be seen. On the contrary, it was believed that a good surgeon should not be squeamish, and his instruments carried the memory of past operations. The main, almost the only virtue of a surgeon was not precision or knowledge, but a beastly speed honed to automatism. Pain was the absolute ruthless monarch of the operating room, and its reign had to be shortened to a few unbearable, endless minutes. And in this art, the Scottish physician Robert Liston was without equal. He was called the fastest knife in the West End, and people paid money to see his bloody, almost theatrical performances. He could amputate a leg in under 3 minutes, and sometimes in as little as 28 seconds, often holding the bloodied knife between his teeth while his burly assistants held down the screaming, convulsing patient. Before starting, he would address the gallery, packed with students and onlookers, with his signature phrase, "Tie me, gentlemen." And to the grating of the saw and the screams of the unfortunate soul, the gruesome yet mesmerizing spectacle would begin. It was an era when the surgeon was not a healer, but a virtuosic, artistic butcher competing against the second hand. Once, during one of these demonstrative amputations, Liston worked so swiftly and with such wide strokes that he accidentally lopped off the fingers of his young assistant, who was holding the patient's leg. The patient and the assistant later died in agony from gangrene and sepsis, and one of the spectators in the gallery, an elderly and impressionable gentleman, died on the spot from shock. This story, though resembling a grim, cruel anecdote, became a symbol of the era before anesthesia and antisepsis. It went down in the annals of medicine as the only operation in history with a 300% mortality rate. It perfectly illustrated the fact that speed, born of pain in itself, became a source of mortal danger. Pain dictated its cruel terms, turning any operation into a frantic race against death and a sophisticated torture that not everyone could survive, physically or mentally. To dull it, any available means were used: opium, hashish, alcohol to the point of unconsciousness, or the most ancient and reliable anesthetic, a well-aimed blow to the head with a heavy object. But most often, there was nothing. The patient simply had to endure while their body was being torn apart, and the only salvation was losing consciousness from the shock of the pain, or a quick, merciful death right on the table. The heart simply could not withstand such a monstrous, inhuman strain. Surgery was a last resort, more terrifying than the disease itself. For centuries, doctors desperately sought a way to conquer pain, but their search was like wandering in the dark among potent poisons and hallucinogens. They stumbled upon substances that could have changed the world, but used them for entertainment or dismissed them as dangerous charlatanry. The cure for suffering was close at hand, but it went unnoticed. Nitrous oxide, or laughing gas, discovered back in the late 18th century by the chemist Humphrey Davy, became known as a parlour amusement for bored aristocrats. Instead of bringing relief to the suffering in hospitals, it became the highlight of parties, where people would inhale the gas from silk bags, falling into fits of hysterical laughter. They laughed until they cried, staggered, fell, and took painful knocks, yet felt absolutely no pain from the bruises and scrapes, continuing their mad revelry. It was merely a fleeting madness, a way to escape Victorian boredom, while in the hospitals, heart-wrenching, blood-curdling screams of agony continued to ring out. The irony was cruel and deafening. A cure for pain existed, but it was used as a cheap fairground toy, as a way to entertain guests. The greatest discovery lay idle while thousands of people suffered. The world was blind to the obvious, preferring familiar torment to an unknown, albeit painless, future. Another powerful candidate was chloroform. The Edinburgh obstetrician James Young Simpson and his friends, in a desperate search for the ideal anesthetic, experimented on themselves. They would gather in the evenings in the dining room and take turns inhaling various chemicals, risking their own lives for the sake of science and the relief of their female patients suffering. One evening, after trying a heavy, oily liquid with a sweetish smell, chloroform, they one by one crashed under the dining table with a thud, plunging into a deep, death-like sleep. Upon waking, Simpson realized he had found something exceedingly powerful, but he also intuitively sensed its immense hidden danger. Soon, chloroform parties became a fashionable and deadly pastime in high society, supplanting laughing gas. Overdosing was a common occurrence, and many participants of such gatherings fell asleep, never to wake again. The search for pain relief had turned into a gruesome game of Russian roulette with one's own health and life. But it was dentists who worked with the most acute, sudden, and unbearable pain who were the first to take a decisive step toward revolution. The American dentist Horace Wells, while watching a fairground show with laughing gas, noticed how one of the participants badly injured his leg on a bench, but, being under the influence of the gas, felt nothing. A brilliant idea occurred to Wells, and the very next day he conducted an experiment on himself, asking a colleague to extract his troublesome wisdom tooth under the influence of nitrous oxide. The procedure was completely painless. Confident in his success, Wells decided to hold a public demonstration at Massachusetts General Hospital in front of the luminaries of Boston surgery. He was absolutely certain of success, as he had previously painlessly extracted his own tooth. But before the skeptical, smirking crowd of doctors and students, something went wrong. Either the dose of gas was too small, or the patient panicked, but at the crucial moment when the forceps touched the tooth, he cried out in pain. Wells was booed, called a fraud and a charlatan. Humiliated, crushed by the devastating failure, he left the stage to the jeers of the crowd, unaware that in the audience sat his former student and partner, another dentist, William Morton. Morton had seen everything and understood his mentor's mistake. The idea was correct, but the gas was too weak and unreliable. Morton decided to use a more powerful and predictable substance, diethyl ether, with which he had already experimented on animals and himself. He was convinced he could succeed where Wells had failed. He obtained permission to conduct another demonstration, staking his entire reputation on it. On October 16, 1846, in the very same surgical theatre that would go down in history as the Ether Dome, Morton conducted his demonstration. A patient named Gilbert Abbott was to have a vascular tumor removed from his neck. In the packed hall, there was a tense, distrustful, almost hostile silence. Morton brought to the patient's face a specially constructed glass inhaler with a sponge soaked in caustic, foul-smelling ether. A few moments later, the chief surgeon, John Collins Warren, the very one who had presided over Wells's failure, began to cut, but no scream followed. The patient was in a deep, peaceful sleep. The operation, which would normally have been accompanied by wild screams and desperate struggling, proceeded in almost complete, reverent silence, broken only by the clinking of instruments and the surgeon's quiet commands. When it was all over and the patient came to, Warren turned to him and asked how he felt. Abbott replied that he felt as if a dull scraper had been drawn across his neck, but there was no real pain. Then Warren turned to the astonished audience and uttered the historic phrase, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." In the hall, where skepticism had previously reigned, deafening, enthusiastic applause erupted. Pain had been overthrown from its 1,000-year throne. But behind this triumphant victory over pain lurked another, more insidious and invisible killer, which was merely biding its time. Surgeons, having gained the ability to operate slowly, thoughtfully, and without screams, began to perform more complex and lengthy interventions deep within the body. And to their horror, they discovered that their patients were dying. They tolerated the surgery itself perfectly well, but a few days or weeks later they were consumed by fever, and their surgical wounds turned into pockets of putrefaction. This phenomenon received the ominous name hospital gangrene. Surgery became safer on the table, but deadlier in the ward. One victory gave rise to a new, even more terrible defeat. In Vienna, at one of the best and most modern clinics in Europe, something inexplicable and monstrous was happening. The Vienna General Hospital had two maternity divisions located side by side in the same building. In the first, where only midwives were trained and worked, the mortality rate of new mothers from puerperal fever was only 4%. In the second division, where medical students practiced under the supervision of renowned doctors and professors, almost 1 in 3 women died. Sometimes the mortality rate reached 30%, and in some months even 40%. The second division became known as the plague barracks or the death ward. Women begged on their knees not to be sent there. They preferred to give birth right on the street, on the filthy cobblestones, risking everything just to avoid that cursed ward, where almost certain death awaited them. A young Hungarian doctor, Ignaz Semmelweis, who worked as an assistant in this ward of death, was in despair. He was obsessed with the idea of finding the cause of this nightmare. He witnessed how young, healthy women who had just given the world a new life died in terrible agony from sepsis. He changed the diet, the ventilation regimen, and even had the women give birth on their sides instead of their backs, but nothing helped. Death continued to mow down the young mothers with terrifying, methodical regularity. The theories were one crazier than the next, reflecting the complete helplessness of medicine. Some blamed an atmospheric cosmic telluric influence, some miasmas that supposedly hung in the air of the ward due to intense scientific activity. Others believed the priest was to blame, who passed through the ward, ringing a bell as he attended to the dead, and that this sound terrified the new mothers. Semmelweis, grasping at any straw, even the most absurd one, ordered the priest to take a different route and remove the bell so as not to traumatize the women's psyches. But this changed absolutely nothing. The women continued to die with the same horrifying frequency. Semmelweis's despair grew into a feverish, manic obsession. He felt that the answer was somewhere nearby, that it was staring him in the face, but he couldn't see it because it was hidden behind a veil of age-old dogmas and superstitions. He performed autopsy after autopsy, comparing records, searching for a clue, a key to this deadly mystery that turned his work into a daily nightmare. The answer came with another sudden death, but this time it wasn't a patient who died, but his close friend and colleague, the respected pathologist Jakob Kolečka. During the autopsy of a woman who had died of childbed fever, one of the clumsy students accidentally cut his finger with a scalpel. A few days later, Kolečka died of sepsis in terrible agony. Semmelweis, who was on leave, learned of the tragedy and, upon returning, immediately requested his friend's autopsy report. Studying it, he experienced a shock that gave way to an epiphany, a flash of brilliant insight. Kolečka's symptoms were absolutely identical to those he had seen hundreds of times in the deceased mothers. He understood everything. His students came to the maternity ward straight from the dissection room, where they had spent hours digging through rotting, decomposing corpses. They carried invisible, cadaverous particles on their hands, which caused the deadly fever in women with fresh childbirth injuries. The midwives from the first safe ward simply did not deal with corpses. On May 15, 1847, a simple but revolutionary notice appeared on the doors of his clinic. Every doctor or student entering the maternity ward, especially after working in the dissection room, was required to thoroughly wash their hands in a basin with a chlorinated lime solution until the cadaverous smell disappeared from their hands. The result was stunning, immediate, and irrefutable. Within a few months, the mortality rate in the second ward plummeted from almost 30% to the level of the first, and then to below 1%. Semmelweis, a mere assistant, had single-handedly defeated the plague of maternity wards. He saved thousands of lives, but his discovery was met not with gratitude, but with hatred. The medical community of Vienna and all of Europe met his idea with ridicule, contempt, and fierce hostility. The very thought that respected doctors, gentlemen with clean hands, could be carriers of death seemed offensive, humiliating, and absurd. He was accused of disgracing the profession. His superior, the clinic director Johann Klein, forbade him from publishing his life-saving statistics, fearing for the hospital's reputation. He was persecuted, called a madman, a fanatic, and a charlatan. He was right, but the world was not ready for his terrible, accusing truth. His colleagues refused to wash their hands, considering it a humiliating ritual. They continued to kill their patients, defending their professional honor and refusing to admit that their hands could be dirty. In the end, Semmelweis's contract was not renewed, and he was effectively driven out of the clinic. He returned to Hungary, where he continued his fight, but no one listened to him anymore. His reputation preceded him. The irony of fate was cruel and merciless. Ignaz Semmelweis, the man who taught the world to wash its hands, ended his own days in an asylum, dying of sepsis. During one of his fits of madness, likely caused by an old syphilitic infection or simply a complete nervous breakdown, he injured his hand and contracted an infection. The report from his own autopsy was frighteningly similar to the autopsy report of Jakob Kolechka, the very victim who had once opened his eyes to the truth. He died from the same disease he had fought his entire life, becoming the final victim of the ignorance he had so desperately tried to eradicate. He was buried in obscurity. His teachings were forgotten for almost 20 years, and all that time, women continued to die. Only years later were Semmelweis's ideas revived and scientifically substantiated thanks to the work of two other giants. The French chemist Louis Pasteur proved that decay and disease are caused by microscopic organisms, microbes. And the British surgeon Joseph Lister, upon reading Pasteur's work, immediately understood its significance for surgery. He realized that it was these invisible killers, these microbes, that Semmelweis had carried on his hands, and that they were the cause of post-operative gangrene. Lister decided to declare a veritable chemical war on microbes in his operating room. Lister, inspired by the germ theory, went much further than simple hand washing. He began to spray carbolic acid into the air of the operating room, a caustic, foul-smelling substance used at the time to purify sewage and treat railway ties. The air filled with a thick, acrid, suffocating fog that made the eyes water. It was a new chemical form of torture in the name of sterility. Surgeons worked in a cloud of acid, their hands and faces covered in painful, chemical burns, and patients sometimes died from antiseptic poisoning, inhaling its toxic fumes. Lister even constructed a special sprayer resembling a steam engine, which was nicknamed the Donkey. But it worked. The number of post-operative infections, cases of sepsis, and gangrene in his wards dropped sharply, dramatically. The era of Liston's bloody chaos and the era of Semmelweis's invisible plague were replaced by an era of sterile, yet still brutal, order. Lister forced surgeons to believe in the invisible enemy and to fear it. Gradually, antisepsis, the fight against microbes already in a wound, gave way to asepsis, the creation of conditions in which microbes would not enter the wound at all. White coats appeared, becoming a symbol of cleanliness rather than a way to hide filth. the operating room transformed from a dirty slaughterhouse into a gleaming tiled temple of sterility. Instruments and dressings began to be boiled in autoclaves, killing the invisible enemies with high temperature and pressure. Surgeons started working in masks and rubber gloves, originally introduced into practice by surgeon William Halstead, to protect the delicate skin of his assistant and future wife from caustic antiseptics, became the final barrier. The circle was complete. The surgeon's touch once again became safe, but at what cost? With how many lives was this path paid for? Every step forward in surgery was made over the bones of those who died from ignorance, from infection, from surgical shock, or from the treatment itself, which proved to be more terrible than the disease. From the scalding oil of Ambroise Paré to Lister's carbolic acid, the path to modern medicine was paved with good intentions that too often led straight to the hell of the hospital ward. And we, living today, are merely the heirs to this grim, heroic, and incredibly bloody history written with scalpel and pain. Today's surgeries, with their lasers, robotic assistants, and precise controlled anesthesia, seem like a true miracle, almost magic. But perhaps in 100 or 200 years, even our most advanced methods, our chemotherapy and transplantology, will be considered a savage, torturous barbarism, worthy only of the pages of a textbook on the dark history of medicine. And behind every miracle of modern medicine, behind every painless incision and sterile, self-dissolving suture, stands the unseen shadow of a surgeon in a blood-soaked frock coat who cut into living flesh in a desperate, almost hopeless attempt to conquer death. His legacy is not only the lives saved, but also an eternal reminder of how thin the line is between healing and killing,